internet to a new format I'm calling Dialectic. In this format, we're going to look at two to three concepts in which we're going to basically try and sum them up and also make them talk or compare them and see what comes out of it. The idea is not to have just a definition and that's it, but really to try and think things through with those concepts. I don't know in advance if I'm going to be good at it, but I'm very eager to try it out. So today what we're going to talk about are the concepts of superego and ideal ego of Freud and Jung's persona and how they can be correlated and they can be overlaid, but there can also be distinctions. So first things first, I'm going to define a bit of what it is, because those are not necessarily very easy concepts, even though they've kind of become mainstream. But I do feel that a little refresh is always a good way to start. So in Freud's theory, there are three main topics. Today, we're just going to talk about the superego, but please note this: the superego, the ego, and the id. We're not going to talk about nor the ego nor the id. So we're going to just focus on the superego and one of its components, the ideal ego. So for Freud, very simply, the superego is our moral consciousness, meaning that it's that kind of judge we have behind our backs that says yes or no, and it kind of guilt trips us when we do something bad, or kind of rewards us when we do something good. It's the easiest way of thinking of it, I feel, is the idea of an internal judge. That internal judge, according to Freud, is created by basically the parents and their image that's internalized within the infant. But more specifically for Freud, it's the father. The father has that role in Freud's theories. Freud, being a man of his time, obviously fathers were going to have that role. But in modern day psychodynamics, we believe that anyone can play a role of superego or offer identification for a superego. And then it can be the mother, the aunt, the father, a brother or a sister, a school teacher, etc., etc. It's not as clear and cut as what Freud put through. And that's how we understand it now. Now, one of the big parts of the superego, and maybe one of the more interesting and subtle ones, is the ideal ego, which, from my understanding, Freud never distinguished. He never said, there's this and then there's that. It's basically a mishmash. He sometimes uses one for the other. It can be kind of confusing. But afterwards, we kind of made a difference between superego and there's a component, meaning a part of it, that's the ideal ego. So what is the ideal ego? The ideal ego is the ideal picture one has of oneself, meaning that basically it's that vision we have of like, oh, I could be this, or I could be that, or oh, this is how I am. And that ideal is also something that we aim towards. We try to accomplish also our ideal ego. And in the same way, it's basically the aspirations of the parents that are going to dictate how the ideal ego forms. And of course, what's interesting with the ideal ego is that it kind of changes throughout life. One can change of ideals or objectives or how he sees oneself or herself. And that's what makes it incredibly interesting. It's much more, in a way, much more changeable and much more evolutionary based than the superego proper that's really set in stone in a way. And the ideal ego, much less. But the idea is that it's that ideal sense of self that people aim to and also like to think that the ego, meaning who they are, correlates with the ideal ego. Meaning that they kind of are ideal, and that ideal, when both are aligned, gives back love and affection. Meaning that basically the person is well adjusted to their picture. So this is basically, very basically, there's so much more nuance and we might one day talk about it, but just this is the main idea of Freud's superego and ideal ego. Now let's talk about the persona, which is a concept invented or conceived by Jung, which basically is that social mask and the way we present ourselves to the world. He, at the start at least, defined it as basically the role we have. For example, I as a psychologist, my persona is a persona of a psychologist. If you're, let's say, a policeman, your persona is that of a policeman. But from my understanding, it has broadened a lot. The persona is no longer one social function. Even in Jung, I think late Jung is more broad than what he used to be. It's basically the idea that what we are, our ego or our self, I will use them interchangeably, is basically quite different from what we show the world. That persona and that ego are not 100%. Basically, the ego might have thoughts that they don't necessarily share to others, and the persona interfaces, meaning that it, how can I say, jams out certain things, or it might present or overexpose or underexpose certain elements given the context, the social context. Now, what I found interesting is basically I feel that all of those concepts are very interesting, and basically I found it very saddening that in psychoanalysis there's such a split. For those of you who don't know, basically Jungian theories and Freudian theories are very split. There's very, very little interlay between them. Even nowadays, for example, Freudians would be very, very hard pressed to acknowledge any Jungian concepts. And from my understanding, Jungians are a bit better, but they always privilege their own concepts. That's how, at least, I have been taught, and how I think most people, when I've had those conversations, see it. My goal here in this video is basically to say that I think both can coexist, at least the idea of persona, which I find is very important, because the thing with Freud's system is that I think it's incredibly interesting and quite accurate, but it's only in a subjective, meaning basically it's what happens within oneself. And it doesn't really take into account what's happening with everyone else, right? That being said, the persona is trying to send an image to others. And that image is what? It's based on the inner subjective. So I think that they're perfect. At least those two theories kind of complement each other. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because basically I think all of that is part of the conscious system, the conscious mind that Freud and Jung talk about. That basically the ego, in a way, tries to protect itself from the world, the self also. And by doing that, it presents an image of a good employee, anything really, a good mother, really anything you can think of that's interactive is there. And basically that image is, I think, shaped within the ideal ego and the superego. But I don't think that they're necessarily what puts that image in interpersonal relationships in place. I think that that is a persona, it's the interface. Basically, if we were to compare it, I would say that basically the, how can I say, the superego and the ideal ego are the frame, where the persona is basically the image in the frame. And that's how I see it, meaning basically when it has to interface, it interfaces in a certain way, and I think the persona has its roots in the ideal ego and the superego. And basically it's an extension. It's an extension that is there to protect all the system and also guarantee an interpersonal peace in a way that could not be done if there was no persona. Now, you might be wondering why I don't bring in Winnicott's concept of false self and true self. It's a very good point, and I will address it at some point one day. But in this video, for the sake of clarity, I'm leaving it out. So the idea you have to take into perspective is that Freud and Jung, basically after they split, I was going to say break up, but that might be a little too romantic. After the professional splits, basically Jung integrated some of Freud's concepts, but Freud went completely cold turkey on Jung, and basically there's no more mention of him. He's, as far as psychoanalysis is considered pure psychoanalysis, he's gone. He's a goner. He virtually never existed. His whole presence was basically a denial, and I find that very saddening, because I think that basically, and up until Winnicott, the psychoanalysis did not have an idea of interrelational frames for outside of childhood, because of course children don't necessarily have a persona. because they're still building everything up. So they don't necessarily interface in the same way. But as a teenager or an adult, one obviously has a persona. One obviously hides and does not share things to others, even though they might feel it. Be it sadness, anger, hatred, dismissal, all those negative feelings, and even sometimes positive feelings are hidden. And that hiding of them, which is an inner subjective experience, is also manifested by the fact that the person is going to play a role at that point. They're going to not necessarily be genuine. And that non-genuineness, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but is there in relationships, is based on the persona. Basically, the persona is the one that interfaces. Like, basically, it's a bit like a program. You don't necessarily see the ones and zeros behind your program, but you see an interface. It's the same for the persona. It's what bonds us with others. And of course, when sins grow deeper with people, some aspects of the persona might recede and genuineness might come forward. It's not to say that we are always disingenuous. Absolutely not. But I think that the persona's role is to obey, in a way, the ego, but I also think that it has its roots within the ideal ego, i.e., in the ideal image we want to project onto the world, the ideal image of a professional, the ideal image of a parent, the ideal image of someone. And that ideal image, in turn, gives a strength to the ego, to the self of the person, that then basically feels rewarded, feels good, feels happy. And it's all good and clear, as the superego is basically the one that drives it. But when things go haywire, as they can do and can happen, well, basically that's where the positive circle kind of breaks down. Basically, the persona is not able or unwilling to show a good image. In turn, the ideal ego and the superego kind of punish together the ego because they were unable to present in a positive enough light to others. And basically, the whole idea is that those three systems, I feel, are incredibly complementary. Like, the persona explains how we behave, and the ideal ego and the superego explain how we feel towards others and towards ourselves. And I think that basically, for the longest of times, all three concepts have been basically splitted and separated. And I feel that in this video, at least, my goal was to try and show how well they fit together. And I hope I succeeded in giving an interesting point of view, and I hope that you understand better the correlation between superego, ideal ego, and persona. So, if there's anything you want to ask, or anything you're interested in, feel free to talk about it in the comments. So, I'll see you in the next one. Bye.